Before we even talk about this collection, someone asked in the chat earlier, is Prada still intellectual? Or do people still think that Prada is intellectual? What do you guys think about that?
Prada stays intellectual as long as we keep talking about it. It being intellectual is a product of like it being a driver of cultural conversation from people who like to talk about this stuff intellectually.
Right.
To me, like that's what makes something intellectual or not. It's not necessarily the designs, it's about the sort of clientele and
Conversation and right.
commentators that are willing to engage with you in that manner and your ability to sort of bring that out of people or fund people and bring people to the point where they can access your brand in this manner.
Interesting.
Yeah. Is Prada intellectual? I don't think it is at this point. Yeah, because I think we discussed it. It was we mentioned that in the previous slide that sometimes they stretch it in the in the brief to the press
Yeah,
to
sometimes
say
it
what they
does
want to
feel a bit
say, but
manufactured. Yeah.
yeah, it's like when you the same when you see art pieces, there is not much there, but you create a whole narrative and concept around it when you go to galleries and things like that. You say, oh, maybe it's meant like this, but actually it doesn't mean it's like a little bit empty. So it's better to be honest and say, we're creating clothes and it doesn't need to be intellectual in that sense, neither. You don't
I think
necessarily.
When we say, sorry, not to cut you off, Anastasia, when we say intellectual, do you mean that like they are worth the deep dive, or they're
No,
having
not
an
that.
academic conversation? Like, what's when we
Yeah,
say?
Yeah,
it's more the academic conversation, not
that
necessarily the
academic
yeah, yeah.
conversation.
Okay, so our Prada, I think Prada are having an academic conversation. Do I think that that academic conversation has the most value to me? No, mainly
Yeah,
because like
not necessarily.
if somebody wants to have a deep conversation about something and like wants to have a well studied conversation with great references, then yeah, they kind of are like intellectual in that way, right? But
Yeah,
is it something that is referential to me as somebody who likes to analyze things? Then I guess the answer will be no. So then they're going after the audience that likes to do that with their clothes, for instance. And that is kind of like my little cop out. No, it's not a cop out, but it's like me saying yes, they are, but only to a certain demographic. But I
hmm
don't think like their clothes, what they're actually delivering is actually intellectual, because like when I look at it, like they don't hit that aesthetic appeal of something that is giving me intellectualism. Like and this is my last one, and then I'll give it back to Anastasia. It's like with Demna and Balenciaga, for better or for worse, Demna was having an intellectual conversation. And as much as it was repetitive, he was still touching on the same points that were worth delving into. And he was making interesting looking things that were like, why is he this? That always asks you to beg the question, why is he designing like this? And that's what sparked the conversation. When I look at Prada's recent collection, this does not spark that style of conversation for me. And that's
Yeah.
that's kind of like my barometer for that.
Yeah, I agree on this. I mean, also what we define as intellectual is like that's something that has depth. That means there are multiple layers to it. For clothes, of course, they don't necessarily need to be intellectual to be attractive for us to want to buy them. They can just be. I mean, it's not a necessity neither that all designers should have an intellectual approach. I agree with you. Demna did that. It was even more political, I would say, than intellectual in Demna's case.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
So,
it's a branding thing. I think from
yeah,
early days of Prada, people have seen Miuccia Prada as an intellectual, and so it's just stuck. And I think even when sometimes they try to keep that as like a brand thing, and it seems a bit contrived, and it seems like they force it through show notes or the way that they talk about like really mundane elements of the making of clothes. Yeah, then that's why that question always comes up. Like, is Prada intellectual? But I also like what Al said, that kind of something being intellectual can also be predicated on the fact that intellectuals talk about it and people that talk about fashion in an intellectual way. If you're kind of
yes.
engaging with Prada and having these kind of conversations, you've kind of put it into an intellectual context.
True.
If you go back to the Instagram page, the actual bio of the Instagram page is thinking fashion since 1913. Like it's marketing, right? But that's the brand. That's the world that you want to buy into if you want to buy into being a product customer.
Is interesting.
Because another thing, as an aside, I want to say, make sure that you go through their messaging, and if they ever bring up craft, they're not intellectual. Because I think, to me, like, what defines an intellectual brand is its sort of relationship to the clothes is conceptual material things versus it being about the craft of manship of the actual materiality itself. It's about the idea.
Wait,
more
why
so
can't
than-
sorry, not to cut
Yeah.
your point off, but like why can't craft be also that?
because to me, I
Craft
relate.
is very pragmatic and like it's a very
With
you know what I mean? It's
technical.
like yeah.
Someone who's craft, okay, when they say artisanal, would that be like a middle ground
I don't-
between that?
I would
don't
say
think artisanal is
artisanal, opposite
intellectual.
of
Yeah, I don't
intellectual.
think it's intellectual.
Artisanal
The
to
materiality
craft.
of the material, actually, I think
Something
I-
being artisanal is like when I
Okay.
think of an artisanal brand, I think of like a brand that explores materials in very unique ways. So I would
Interesting.
say that's still in the realm of like craft
But
rather than
well, I don't want to get into the weeds, but I was just thinking on artisans, craftsmen,
yeah,
like they work with the craft. Yeah,
yeah.
it's just a messaging thing. I just wanted to know. But yeah, sorry, Al, I didn't know whether I
Yeah,
cut your.
I'm not saying that Prada's clothes are not well made. They just aren't. They're increasingly not so. But
Shout out to Miu Miu.
of the idea of like
Yeah.
Prada presents itself intellectually is that it can give a value proposition for their brand, that you are participating in the consumption of a fashion product driven by a conceptual artist's way of thinking. Of this is the concept first, and we explore it through the materiality of the collection more so than having to deal with anything what they call sub-symbolic, right? Like the clothes, the stuff that you buy in the store is sub-symbolic to the intellectualism of like the design.
Can I
Currently,
just
right? Go ahead.
Can I just one more thing that just came to my mind that when we're using the word intellectual, I would say that intellectual collections or designers are also those that have an emotional aspect to them, something that you see and it moves you, For me, that's also very intellectual because that means there are layers to it, there is depth. It means something, it's meaningful beyond clothes. As we said, conceptual. So I would equal even something being intellectual with something. It moves you in a way, If you think about all great designers that were intellectual, they were creating emotions to people. They were not like McQueen, Margiela, this kind of Salayan, it was mentioned in the comment, this kind of brands, They move you because they give you something that has more substance beyond clothes. So I would say that, yeah.
Yeah, to me, the most intellectual a fashion brand could ever be is if they just released the designs and never manufactured any of them. That would to me be the
Sure.
most intellectual.
Which is basically what Rei Kawakubo does slightly at her main line. It's like the whole point of it is just to like tell a story through clothes with little to no intention of selling much of it.
Yeah.
Or the fact that like her product is the luxury is secondary to the design and like the intellectual inspiration.
That's true also, because she will use polyester because it's kind of achieving, let's say, a certain form that she wants over the quality of like the polyester being bad. Like she doesn't actually care about that.
Yeah, and like that's like why she has me as a customer. Like my fucking comm jacket, it's fused with glue instead of stitched like a traditional tailoring. And like if she did have hand stitching and the canvassing instead of gluing the canvassing, it would have added another $1,000 to the MSRP, and I wouldn't have been able to afford it. Right? And the sort of prioritization of design over luxury is something that speaks to me as a customer of intellectual brands.
Yeah.
Agreed. Anastasia, quickly, what did you think about this Prada collection overall? Kind of what were your thoughts?
In general, there is coherence in Prada in every season. More or less, I like what they do, but like recently, I'm not particularly, shocked or surprised. But they stay, in my opinion, they are always interesting in their details, certain things, but I'm not overly excited, This thing with the cuffs was particularly funny because you're going to have
The stained cuffs that everyone was talking about.
a high price tag for something. First of all, it has been done like treatment of clothes. It has been done. Besides that, it so contradicts the fact that this is usually people that don't have the means that would wear stained clothes, or like working class people. So it's so interesting that you are putting that element, but then the price tag is very high. it's comical, and it's not even really treatment to create interesting stories. Really, it's just stained, you know. Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. I feel that they missed the point on this one.
To me, like intellectually speaking, stains are low hanging fruit, right? Because you can very easily draw
Yeah.
like the line from we like to buy distressed clothing because it shows provenance of wear to provenance of wear that is undesirable in the form of like stains or mold or something like that is equally like cognizant with the process of wearing, but like we value one over the other because the other feels unhygienic regardless of whether or not it was produced in a factory. Like that's an intellectual way of thinking about the design, right? But it's like a very low hanging fruit thing. And it's too accessible, which to me means it's a weak product collection because if you're judging it intellectually, if it's all low hanging fruit and you can easily understand the reasoning behind it, there's not a lot to digest and get lost in and enjoy. Which, and to me, enjoying a product collection is going, whoa, this is like kind of ugly. I don't really understand what Miuccia's doing. And it
Right.
takes me months to figure out like really what she's doing with the styling, with her attitude, and her approach to like referencing both workwear and cinema and all the other things that are kind of in her bubble. And that's what I like about Prada is because you can do that. But if you can get to it immediately, if the format can be figured out in like a week, that's not a good collection.
In the realm of like it being an intellectual brand, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like what you're saying is so true because earlier Prada, it was like kind of confusing to understand because it was like, why is she mixing patterns that don't make sense? Like, why is she mixing colors that don't make sense? Like, that's why it's ugly. But then people are trying to understand it's ugly, but it's like kind of chic. It's ugly chic. It's kind of ugly and terrible, but it's also amazing and it looks good. Like, what the hell? That is actually quite intellectual. But I think now, which is why I always say it kind of feels forced, is like, you look at a collection, you know that it's kind of like this theme of like deconstruction, reconstruction. But instead of kind of what we associate with deconstruction, reconstruction, like exposed seams, big stitches, all that kind of stuff, instead they've just taken elements of clothing and put them in different places or kind of changed kind of what we associate with clothing. So like the bucket hats, one side is longer than the other. It's kind of off center a bit, or they've taken the storm flaps off of a trench coat and put it somewhere else, or they have these like removable cuffs that are kind of separate that are also stained. So it's kind of like deconstruction, reconstruction, but done in a very simple way and not really that intellectual to me, if I'm going to be honest. And it's like all very obvious to like sight. And that's why as time has progressed, I really struggle to understand what the hype around Prada is the more that time progresses, because it's just not very... I don't find the ideas very interesting or worthy of like acting like what they're doing is like so supremely intellectual.
I agree.
Leo says, so this is more in the ugly chic side than the intellectual side. Not necessarily, but yeah, this is such a good point though. I believe that Prada is a victim of trading intellectualism for marketability. 100%.
Ah, yeah.
100%. But even like what Al said earlier about the marketability, like even in their description, it's like thinking fashion since 1913. It's kind of like they're trying to force you into believing that they're intellectual as like a brand signifier. It's like, if you're intellectual, I don't really think you need to convince people of that. I don't really think you need to like weave it into your marketing. I think people just really understand, oh, this is like really intellectual, the way that they go about things. So the fact that they feel the need to kind of turn that into a market signifier to the point of putting that in their brand bio says that it's just a marketing tool that has been used to market Prada and what it represents.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on this. I still feel these cuffs are a miss.
You don't like the
Yeah,
stained cuffs?
because not that I have a problem with staying, well, I do, but it's just that you're gonna pay a lot of money for something that looks like it's worn. Okay, maybe that's the concept. Yeah, that's the concept, but what? I mean, this is not like really a very interesting concept.
Yeah.
That it looks like it's worn, but actually it's not worn. And then on top of that, the calf has, I think, the calf button is, you can tell it's a high-end shirt kind of contrast there. But yeah, they're working on these little details. It's almost like they're trying to find new ideas, but they cannot make it big enough. It stays on the details, and you say little things, and they try to pull it to make it look like it's more important than it is. Actually, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the cuffs are supposed to look like it's like moldy and stuff like that, but that's just like the dye treatment. But I find it interesting though that in fashion, like, we really focus on some of the most mundane things. Like, this was such a big story on social media about the stained cuffs and like Prada having stained cuffs and what that means for society as a whole. I just found the whole conversation really, really fascinating. Like super, super fascinating.
Well, then it worked. It worked intellectually. If they talked about it, you've been fired.
Especially because so many brands have done it before. Like so many brands have used that as an idea. Like it's not even like remotely new or fresh in any way.
Yeah.
I mean, like Prada is using it to me, like I think is speaking about like class and like work and intellectual work and that being under attack by AI and all this sort of stuff, right? Like there's some stuff that they're accessing because they're Prada doing this particular thing about the cuffs. But there's like the way you use like wear on clothes or damage on clothes to tell a story in your brand can be very different and depends on the material. Like I'm thinking of this Korean brand. I forget their name is. But their whole shtick behind their brand is that they take like workwear and they sun dye it, sun destroy it, sun bleach it, in the sense that like about time and like not time in the sense that like this garment has been worn, but maybe it's been left up in a shop window and damaged by the sun because of its exposure to the sun in that manner. They're not worn in other ways like with sandpaper or anything. It's just sun damage, and it's sort of meditation on time. Because like sun damage only happens due to UV exposure over a long period of time. Yeah. So they're making time as like a house code into the garment in that intellectual manner, right? And so the manner of damage,
that's a very different thing.
Like how you talk about it, it's specifically like the hygienic element is like particularly powerful and super blunt, maybe even shallow. Kiddie pool shallow could be a way of describing like the ease of accessibility there. But it obviously escaped just the fashion sphere and got I would say it was a crutch, actually, we'll say. Maybe, that's shallow and slow hanging fruit. And that's why so many people, were energized to talk about it and join in.
And were able to. That's a good point.
That's that.
That's a very good point. The fact that people outside of fashion could understand it enough to relate to it in such an easy way kind of says a lot about the mode in which they go about trying to form this intellectualism. Because, for example, like the Korean brand that you said does the sun dye treatments, that's not going to reach the broader audience to have like a deeper conversation about it. It just won't. Like people are just going to see a garment that looks bleached, sun bleached, and not really say, or it looks faded in a certain way because sun normally like interacts with the dyes and makes like especially blacks look faded. That's the only thought they're going to have, and no conversation will be coming out of that unless you actually understand it as a house code and you're like part of the target audience of the brand.
Yeah.
The marketing worked. That's funny. Like, everyone's so afraid of being corny these days that it just loops around into corny marketing again. Just be yourself. That's more sustainable in the long term. Agreed.
Yeah, but what if your whole personal identity and the identity of your brand is based around corny marketing? What about that, huh? You ever think about that?
Even like this technique that they use to kind of make it look kind of like the outer layer of the fabric is ripping apart and what the fabric you're seeing under is kind of like the inner lining of the fabric type of thing. And distressing. And I find that a much better way of kind of trying to illustrate what they're saying than the stained cuffs, personally.
Yeah.
Stuff like
Definitely.
this.
Yeah, but again, this is sort of like not easy, but like low-hanging fruit. I'm not going to necessarily call it shallow because like you can have like I think ways of using that as a vehicle to discuss intellectual ideas and topics and concepts, but like it's just such low-hanging fruit. Like Daniel Ashram has collections, the sculptor has collections like with Pokemon, and he makes like Pokemon figurines where like it's broken apart and it looks like it's a deteriorating crystal and whatever. I don't know if you know those, but like it's just like it's such an easy and accessible way of doing it that it feels not necessarily intellectually dishonest, but it's cheapening to its brand's own sort of ethos of intellectualism.
Right. And I think to me that's the issue I've had with Prada, because I don't necessarily have an issue with the products. It's just this insistence of how intellectual the brand is, like by them and by everyone around it and everyone that talks about it. And I just don't understand what's so intellectual about it.
It's a recession indicator, man. They've got to move those black turtlenecks. It's tough out here.
I saw a TikTok the other day, and the person was talking about like the different kinds of people that wear different kinds of brands. And the person was like, you would only wear Prada if you're like a poet or a really cool artist. And I was like,
oh my God.
I was like, no, I think you'd wear Yoji if you're that person, not Prada. Like, but it's just because of that thing. Once again, it's like this artificial kind of mirroring of what Prada is supposed to represent to people.
Yeah.
To me, I think Prada is valuable not because I buy their clothes, but because they, have an ethos of being conceptual. And I think that's a positive thing. And when they do good collections, I'm very happy for them. And when they do like sort of shallow collections, I go, ooh, the pocketbooks are tight. And, to me, that's what I get out of interacting, with their brand. The turtlenecks, I can buy, Raf's Calvin Klein turtlenecks at a much cheaper price on a secondary market. It's the same stuff materially. But I think Prada is particularly interesting because I started thinking about them and their sort of positioning in their customer base as like a white collar workwear brand. That's really where you find Prada is like the Prada briefcases and so on and so forth. Because of their ability as like a luxury product, you have these sort of very hard wearing things, right? They're a leather goods company originally. They make nylon things, and these are sort of things that kind of withstand the wear of like using it in your daily life as somebody who works in an office, right? And they're sort of lane kind of the product that they move like is sort of very situated in that. And then on top of that, you have this sort of intellectualism of their ready to wear line, which again, most of that is not what moves in stores. And so like I kind of look at them more in the same space as Tom Brown, where the fact that you can't buy any of this stuff, or like the fact that like the sort of craziest ready-to-wear elements are not accessible to their main customer base is as being okay, because like that's they're contributing, they're really contributing, I think, to the culture in that manner. But when they have to sort of I'm not going to say stoop themselves, maybe they just didn't have any ideas this season, but like the fact that they are easy to communicate means that there's just less that they're contributing this year. And if like the trend continues and they just get dumbed down as Miuccia kind of takes a back seat, it I don't know, it loses worth as a brand and they fall off. Brands fall off, and that's fine. We should let companies die. That's I'm not bail out. So yeah.
This comment is just hilarious. Like, the real intellectuals are staining their clothes and keeping them that way because they don't know how to do their... Yeah, that's so true, because it is like a very common stereotype that intellectuals tend to be like very messy and like all over the place because they spend all their time thinking and don't have time for anything else.
Yeah, just thinking all day long. Yeah, every time. So funny, this stereotype.
But that's kind of what I found really interesting, even like the discourse that was being had around this collection. Like, I remember like people were asking if like this collection was like rage bait and like all those kind of things because of the techniques that they were using, which I found like really fascinating.
I mean, yes, like conceptual stuff has to be rage bait. It's got to like conceptually draw out emotion from you. Not necessarily rage, but you've got to have some sort of response to it. And it's got to, and Prada historically has been challenging. It's got to be challenging aesthetically on top of all that. And the fact that to the trained fashion eye, this is not challenging aesthetically. It may even be, conservative or reductionist in the sort of oeuvre of Miuccia's work. Is it's kind of funny. Sometimes you add a bigger audience and like the trend changes, of what people's, I guess, response to something is.
What is Leah saying? This is the one people are questioning. This magic collection. Yeah, this is literally the one. But yeah, all in all, basically all of this to say, I didn't like the collection. I thought it was super low-hanging fruit. I thought that all their ideas are like very commonly used ideas in fashion, like extremely commonly used ideas. Like the kind of ideas that like when I review graduate designer collections, there's at least 5 to 10 designers have with these kind of ideas every year. On top of like this, like without erasure, new ideas created bearing echoes of a collective anterior. It's just, it's because obviously I'm being sarcastic, but it's not based on what we see in a collection versus what they write about themselves and how they like to talk about. Like a persistence of universal human values, values of civilization, culture, meaning, intelligence, care, may be conveyed through clothes. Carrying impressions of life, they underscore the significance of duration. To remember is a sign of respect. Now, the problem with that is that a stain is not necessarily like a significance of duration. Because unlike, let's say, like what Al mentioned, which is like, sun treating something is a permanent thing that happens to clothing. Yeah. The only way to get it back to normal is to re-dye it with the original dye. Something like a stain is not really an indicator of necessarily time, because a stain happens and then you're like, yeah, I'm going to clean it. I'm going to put it in the washing machine or give it to the dry cleaner. It's the worst way to kind of try and indicate time. And they've literally said that in the show. It's literally the worst way to kind of use it as an example of like, this is how we interact with our clothing and how our clothing changes with time. Something like a stain is like the worst way to do that.
Yeah, 100%.
So that's why, like, there's just such a disconnect. It's just such a disconnect.
To me, reading an artist statement is the most cringeworthy shit in the world, because it's like obviously an avenue of marketing where the actual product that you are showing cannot clearly communicate itself. It's such that you have to supplant it with words to explain yourself, to justify yourself, right? And what the best art statements do is that they don't fucking mention anything that you would ever think of regarding the collection. Like, how could you possibly, tie this to like the history of colonialism or something like that? Because the reason why they do that is to widen the scope of what you now believe the artist is capable of. Right? Because you couldn't make that connection yourself. You now have this sort of, I don't know, a created reality that the artist has slapped this through from so many angles that it can encompass the breadth of what's encapsulated in the artist statement. And like, to me, is that intellectually dishonest, or is that a way of like providing added value from the conceptual artist to like something that they may not even have been thought of when they were making it, but something that they could apply post haste to the collection, such that to expand the range of what it's intellectually or conceptually involving itself with, right? And the idea of doing that after the fact, where it's not your initial inspiration that you're trying to communicate, but also possible other avenues of intellectually approaching the conceptual artwork or what have you, that to me is like a value add, is annoying, because you're like, how do you get here from this, right? And they did it. They just came up with it afterwards to expand, the value of what they were doing conceptually. And to me, like, that feels a little bit intellectually dishonest, because it isn't a clear communication of the route that you got to the collection with, but it at least expands the scope of thinking and ability to talk about it, have a conversation about it. The problem is when you get shit like this, which just feels totally dishonest, and it doesn't ring true. And so it's a humongous danger to me to ever read an artist statement, or even to put one out, which is like, why I always say, just make what you're going to make and shut up and never discuss the reason.
Right. Ray Kawakubo style.
Well, even she puts out like a word. She'll put out like a word or a theme, and that's usually enough for people. And usually she does what I said, the good artist does, where it's a value add, where you're like, how did you get there from this word? And you can start thinking about it, and it's a vehicle for like, driving further intellectual stimulation from the work.
Do you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of something that I read when I was studying fashion journalism. There's like a paper called like Prada and the Art of Patronage. I'm not sure how many of you have read it, but it's like basically talking about how, like Miuccia Prada has aligned herself with art and the art space by buying into it, but not really necessarily involving herself in art, other than just being a patron of it, and then using that as a way to kind of associate Prada with art and intellectuals, essentially. And how like being a patron of art has kind of turned her marketing or her personal brand into being seen as someone that is like very intellectual, like art forward. And I find that really interesting, because I think it's like, it kind of speaks to this like contrived way of gaining access to what is deemed intellectualism, if that makes sense, in a like very commercial, capitalistic way. And it just reminds me of it's like when you read stuff like this and then people start talking about Prada being intellectual, it's like, are they intellectual, or have they marketed themselves that way?
Yeah.
I mean, she paid for a space to do that, right? The Foundation Prada, I don't know if you've been, but like it's like there's sort of like private. But the specific kind of art that she collects is conceptual, I would say. I mean, you're not going to find like old Italian masters, even if she's in Italy. You're going to find like Jeff Koons, people like what's her face, Louise Bourgeois. Like it's all conceptual stuff, because that's what she wants to align her brand with. And is it like is it cheap that she's just a collector, or is it like the fact that like there's all that stuff you get to see for free, not for free actually. It's like a nominal fee, but it's not like $25. Like I've been to some art exhibits in Korea that were just art, had no sort of association with any sort of commercial project, but they cost more. The Prada stuff like sort of pays for the marketing arm, which is this sort of intellectual art foundation. But there's that. But there also is a free library that you don't have to pay to get into. That's got like reams and reams of books in different languages about like cultural stuff and art and stuff like that. You can all go there for free and use their free Wi-Fi and do all that. There's a cafe that she had somebody design, and like all that stuff is real. It is actually functionally a piece of like the sort of art community in Milan. Like it does exist. whether or not like you feel like it's cheap that she just used like the fashion money to buy into that is secondary to the fact that it exists and people like it and use it.
Right.
And she doesn't do this shit where like she like flies everybody out to a remote location like YSL every year and like forces journalists to like, you know, use all the carbon and jet fuel and all that stuff. She has her shows at the Foundation Prada. You come every year. It's the same place. It's nice.
Yeah. It's like, to be fair, I actually love Miuccia Prada. I'm a fan of her, but I do think that she's always been like a walking contradiction. It's like, what was that thing that Dana Thomas said about her in How Luxury Lost Its Luster? Like how she was like an activist and like she was trying to be like a communist, but it was like, albeit Yves Saint Laurent wearing, parents own a Rolls Royce communist. It's like, that's a literal living contradiction. So it's like, I've always found her to be a bit like anything she tries to represent, there's always like an inherent contradiction when you look deep enough into it.
Well, like I keep going back to Damien Hirst, but Damien Hirst, like famously, like when asked why he made a diamond encrusted skull, said, "Well, you know, I make about stuff that is about the world around me, and what's around me is money." Right? It's like, regardless of where she started being a communist or a student activist or whatever, like her customers are the fascists of the world, are the leaders of the world, are the capitalists of the world, are the extractors of the world. Right? That's who is she? She is surrounded with, and the idea that like she even bothers to connect to the intellectual, the artistic community outside of also, you know, surrounding herself with fascists. I think, you know, it speaks to like, I don't know the complexity of her character, but at least, you know, the sort of, I think, need to be perceived, or or maybe her personal want to participate in those circles. Like, regardless, you know, the telling thing is what she has in her own home. I saw a picture on Instagram the other day about like what art she actually keeps in her own house, not at the Foundation Prada, but she like owns, like, you know, is comfortable like living with. And there's like a bunch of stuff from like Italian futurist fascist artists and stuff like Leo Fontana and all these blue chip names, like a bunch of fascists, and that's what she lives with. So
yeah, it's just so interesting. But I do think that like because I do think Miuccia is intellectual. I think maybe Raf isn't as much. So like that's why Prada's where it is, because I do think Prada used to be intellectual. But that aside, I think, so the thing about like the communism and her being an activist when she was younger, I think there's like levels to it. So it doesn't necessarily negate all her efforts, but it's to say that like there's a level to which you can claim that you are something. So for example, Demna used to make a lot of critiques about general society and how much he hates it and how much he hates the fashion system, while also benefiting highly from the fashion system and enriching himself within that system. So someone can say, well, there's a bit of a contradiction there. And he can argue, well, we all exist in the system and therefore we all have to we all play a part, and therefore me critiquing it doesn't negate the critique. However, if he was to his core, if that's how he felt, he would just quit fashion as a whole. And that would be like the final level of the critique, right? But he's not going to do that because he values how much fashion enriches him personally to ever make that final step to say fuck you to fashion completely, if that's what he feels. So that you always have to like critique it to like a certain like element. There's like levels to how much people claim that, you know, they carry certain beliefs.
Yeah.
In Italy, it's called Kashmir communist. I didn't even know that was like a thing, like a phrase that people use. That's hilarious.
In America, we call it champagne communism or champagne socialism, right? But to me, I think like that's unfair, because to be inundated with ideas about politics or intellectualism or philosophies of thought or any sort of like access to that, you need to have a high level of education. And you have high level of education either because you're either very fortunate and you have access just through scholarship or whatever, or you're fucking loaded, right? Especially in America, education costs, you know, an arm and a leg. And so the idea that just because you come from a class of privilege, or that you've got a lot of money, that your opinion or your political like beliefs are somehow compromised is, I think it's just wrong. Right?
I don't think it's to do with like where you come from. I think it's more to do with if you're actively still participating in the things that you claim are creating all the issues in society.
Right, but luxury is not politics, and you should not confuse them.
Right.
You know, luxury is just not politics. It doesn't matter if, like, you know, your cashmere sweater was like harvested by poor people and like processed over 15 years by somebody's uncle, and you got it for $15 after the uncle died. It doesn't matter. It's still cashmere. It's still luxurious, and it took a lot of time, effort, skill, craft, and etc. to manufacture this very exclusive item. That is secondary to your political beliefs and the fact that you like having something nice made out of cashmere. It to me, like, intellectualism, political leanings, and all that is totally separate from.
You think it's separate? I don't think it's completely separate, because I think that the luxury industry is kind of like an indicator of like where we are as society. So like, for example, part of being, let's say like you're deep communist, right? Then luxury is kind of like an indicator of kind of what you fight against, because there are aspects of luxury that literally the only reason why certain people can buy like a car for 10 million is because of like the disparity between like incomes based on a capitalistic system. So I think it's still involved in there. I think that luxury still plays a part in all of it.
To me, it's so hard to make that argument for material culture, because, like, for instance, what if you grew up poor and you had to have 3 generations of people in your home because none of them could afford their own separate homes, right? But because, you know, you're all living together for economic reasons because of your poverty, your grandmother, who has nothing else to do because she can't work in the field, can like knit for 15 years straight one beautiful thing that she like gathers, you know, materials from that are very piecemeal that you have from, you know, your one goat that you have in your village, right? She shears a goat, and 1 year she gets it up to adjust a little bit more, and in the end you have this incredibly luxurious piece of material object that would be thousands to like just commission for somebody to do. But because, you know, you've supported, you know, the ability of your relation of this person to like make this thing materially, due to, you know, the survival circumstances of, you know, paying for their food and lodging because they couldn't support themselves otherwise. Because of that, you've crystallized that craft and that time into a luxurious object. And the fact that like a poor person could have, you know, access to this and not want to sell it for money in an in an economic exchange does not make their you know, ownership of that luxurious item in any way problematic, in my opinion.
Oh no, but that's actually even better, because them not wanting to sell it is not wanting to participate in the culture. Do you see what I'm saying? So actually, I would say that actually showcases that they believe in, like, if that was kind of like their viewpoint politically, if that was like their stance, they would actually showcase that they believe in that more. I always think that like your personal actions should align with whatever if you're claiming to be. So for example, like, I've never come on my live streams and been like, I am the bastion of sustainability, so people don't hold me to that standard. But if you're Stella McCartney and you're seen to be, you know, like using real fur, people are going to have an issue with it because of how you've branded yourself. So if Miuccia Prada, in her case, was literally, I think she was a member of the Italian Communist Party, actually. Like, if you're a member of the Italian Communist Party, I think your lifestyle and like the decisions you make in your life should align with it. Otherwise, there's a contradiction that can be critiqued.
Right, but usually when people say cashmere communists or champagne socialists, they're referring to their personal mode and taste of personal consumption, not what they're producing on a scale. Right? Somebody being called a champagne socialist does not mean that they make champagne. It means that they consume champagne and they enjoy luxurious things. And somehow there's this false, I think,
their ability to enjoy luxurious things.
The fact that like they enjoy luxury is somehow a moral weakness or a sort of contradiction to their political beliefs, which, again, like I said, could not be farther from the truth. The idea that you would enjoy the luxury of your grandmother's quilt over $15,000 or whatever does not make you, you know, somehow illegitimate in your political beliefs.
Yeah, agreed. I think your issue is more with like the branding, like what it means to be a cashmere like communist. It's basically negating any idea or statement you have to say about communism because you're a cashmere communist. Like, how could you understand? But on the flip side, I would say if that cashmere, what the person that's being called a cashmere communist, let's say in this case is Miuccia Prada, if that person is kind of living and existing in a lifestyle that kind of contradicts what they claim their belief is, I definitely think that kind of negates their viewpoint or their position on what they claim to believe.
To me, it's about, you know, personal consumption is one thing, and that's where the language is like sort of attacking is your personal consumption habits and tastes. And then like your industrial like output, what you choose to put your labor, your capital, your financing, what you choose to consume and from whom, that's a different sphere. That obviously you can attack. But your own personal taste and your own personal consumption versus what you output into the world, like I think the output's the only thing that matters.
Yeah, agreed. Look
And
at
to me,
Prada
with that last
forcing us
collection,
into
Muse is
conversation.
adding trash on the pile. It's not very.
But yeah, I think, I don't know. When last did I like a Prada collection? I need to actually think about that. Let me go on Vogue Runway. Because I just found a lot of like the ideas to be a bit contrived. Let me actually have a look on Vogue Runway. I'm actually curious to see. Luke said mid-2010s. Interesting. Okay, the concept of the shirt, I remember that. I remember when they were doing like, this was when they were doing like the concept, this was like earlier Miuccia and Raf, this was like the whole concept of like uniforms and what uniforms mean in society. That's why they had like the school uniform, like the workwear uniform, all that sort of stuff. I do think they kind of over-intellectualized that stuff too. Let's see. I remember Fall Winter 2018, I liked, that was like the whole nylon thing. I like that from a product perspective, and Spring Summer 2019, I really love that from a product perspective. Intellectually, probably not so much. Okay, I'd say some of these collections I really love, like Resort 2018, I really love. Fall Winter 20. I'd say About Here is like, these are the product collections that like I could defend into the end of the ground. So that's very
Fall
interesting.
18 was like the top.
Yeah, those were like, okay. So that's how far back I had to go. Leak says Fall 2015. Interesting. Yeah, the scaffolding collection, that was this one here, Fall Winter 25. That's this one here.
That was not bad at all.
Yeah,
That
it's
was
not bad. That's the
R.E.
one
Davis
that,
show.
yeah, the little like cowboy boots that they had to, and like all that sort of stuff. And that was on the menswear show. I remember this. Yeah, it wasn't bad. But like, there's not much. Because the collections I'm talking about, there was actually like a level of intellectualism, which is why I can defend it into the ground, because I feel like there were just much bigger statements being made in general about everything. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind-the-scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club, where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.